Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to the podcast British Culture, Albion Never Dies. The alphabet of Britishness is back. This month I'm looking at the letter S. What does S stand for in the alphabet of Britishness? I asked my wife and she said S stands for Stephanie Crichton, which is her name. So, of course it can stand for S is for Stephanie. Of course she hears all these podcast episodes before they're even recorded. I talk them through with her. But I asked on my Instagram, on my Facebook, and I immediately got from Pete Brooker, snooker. Of course he's the author of From Tailors with Love, with his co-author Matt Spacer, and of course he's on the YouTube as well, From Tailors with Love. A few people suggested sport as well. So I looked through the Britishness of various sports. It seems that Britain has invented a wide variety of sports, or at the very least, we have codified them in such a way that the rest of the world has agreed with. So we codified football from 1863, cricket from 1787, rugby from 1871, golf as early as 1502, basketball, volleyball, hockey. Even thought that we might have invented baseball. It's first referred to in a British children's book, a little pretty pocket book written in 1744. And of course, it invented rounders, although it has some French influence, and I've also heard it referred to as Dutch rounders, although I couldn't find much reference to it. I remember that's what it was called at the children's school I went to. I found a lot of detail on the website Made Up in Britain, especially about football. According to them, the origin of football, referred to as soccer by some, can be found in every corner of geography and history. The Chinese, Japanese, Italian, ancient Greek, Persian, Vikings, and many more played a ball game that kind of resembles football. The Chinese football games date back as far as 3,000 years ago, and of course the ancient Greeks and Romans used football games to prepare warriors for battle. In Britain too, there are records of football being played for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it was in England that the modern game of football really began to take shape. In 1863, the first Football Association, FA, was found in England. According to them, according to Made Up in Britain, in the Freemasons' Tavern in Great Queen Street, London, on the 26th of October 1863, rules for the modern game were laid down in a series of meetings. Central to these meetings was Ebenezer Cobb Morley, who lived from 1831 to 1924. He wrote to Bell's Life newspaper proposing a governing body for the sport that led to the first meeting. He wanted a common set of rules so that clubs from all over the nation could compete with each other. Little did he know this would become the biggest sport in the world. My own thoughts on this: it is remarkable, once you start to get the middle classes moving around on trains, suddenly this becomes a factor, the ability to compete with each other all over the country. Before then, of course, football could be very, very localised. As it says earlier in the article, as far as 3,000 years ago, people were playing football with each other, but of course it's a village playing among itself, a village playing with the next village. You read medieval accounts of football games in England which could span rivers and hills and mountains and all sorts. But it was all played according to rules that everybody locally understood. But of course people didn't travel around in quite the same way that we did from the Victorian era onwards. In fact, if you want to have a real look into how the railways changed life in the UK and then started to change life around the world, I think you couldn't do better than checking out Michael Portillo's Great British Railway Journeys, which you can see highlights and clips on YouTube. You can find it on various streaming services. It's a fantastic series for the social, cultural history of our railways. He'll travel around just the little railways in the UK using a Victorian guide to the railways to see what's changed. And he's an interesting man, a former Conservative Member of Parliament and Cabinet Minister who's found a new lease of life as a TV presenter on these rather quaint TV shows, but I think gives a fantastic insight into the UK and also a good feel for how the railways changed Britain. So, that was football, and I really enjoyed looking into that. Then, I enjoyed looking into, cricket. I found a really good BBC article, The 7 Amazing Sports Invented in the UK, just had a really strong article on cricket, which it referred to as that rather confusing game of bats, balls and wickets, which tends to last for several days and is of uncertain origin. Nevertheless, we can be pretty sure it was invented in England. The first definitive reference to the sport appears in a piece of court evidence given in Guildford in 1597. The first international matches were held in the late 1800s. Heather Knight, captain of the England women's cricket team, came in for a chat with Radio 2 after they had won the Women's Cricket World Cup last year. Interestingly, the Women's Cricket World Cup, which launched in 1973, is 2 years older than the men's, which kicked off in 1975. I don't know if kicked off is the right term to use with cricket. I wouldn't like to kick one of those balls at speed. But anyway, it does seem to be a peculiarly British and Commonwealth sport, and in many places where I've worked, say in the Gulf, you can see people from India and Pakistan playing cricket pretty well anywhere there's a space to do so, and with pretty well any equipment that can function. It has spread throughout the world. Famous cricketer, I just thought I'd have a look. William Gilbert Grace, well, he's well known in English classrooms as the man with the most magnificent beard in Victorian England, but of course he is the greatest cricketer in Victorian England. Dominating physical presence, gusto and inexhaustible energy made him a national figure, performing outstandingly well in matches well into his 60s. Perhaps one of the more famous cricketers of recent years, post-war years rather than recent, is Sir Alec Douglas-Home, first-class cricket player and later Prime Minister for a whole 363 days, a relatively long tenure compared to Liz Truss. He is the second shortest serving Prime Minister since the Second World War, but a fine cricketer, and not thought to be a bad Prime Minister, actually. But, as I say, it was Pete Brooker who got there first, suggesting S is for snooker, and I have to give it to him. It did have the most interesting, to me, it's all subjective, interesting to me, history of any of the British-invented sports. And I found this article, The Origin of Snooker, the Neville Chamberlain Story, not that one, the other one, by a man called Peter Ainsworth. He wrote, "The game of snooker was invented by Neville Chamberlain in 1875. Everyone knows that." Well, to be honest, I didn't know that, and I don't know if you knew that, but now I've read it, I know it, and I've read it to you, so now you know it. Anyway, he continues, "To be more precise, this is today's commonly accepted theory, but prior to 1938, there was an equally accepted theory that the game had been introduced by a Colonel Snooker of the Royal Artillery. Then came the momentous day when Sir Neville Francis Fitzgerald Chamberlain at last responded to the umpteenth letter speculating on the game's origins and staked his own claim, which was published in the Field on 19th of March 1938. I just mention here, because he doesn't really go into this in his article, that this gentleman, Sir Neville Francis Fitzwilliam Chamberlain, was Inspector General of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, from 1900 until 1916, resigning after the Easter Uprising, although himself cleared of any wrongdoing. It was on his retirement that he claimed his role in inventing or perhaps popularising snooker, which has been accepted by many. He has led a very interesting life and career aside from snooker, although the snooker is itself very interesting. This man, of course, was a British Army officer in India, and snooker seems to have been largely played by British officers in India during their duller assignments. For example, in Uta Command, known as Uti, or Simla, or Shimla, for that you should definitely read Kipling. And they would play it, for example, after campaigns in Afghanistan. Peter Ainsworth wrote that those recovering from wounds that were too light for the hospital but too severe to leave India for home would often just stay in army messes, along with those waiting to go into the field. So they're the full variety of young lads, and not so young lads, amusing themselves with various games. So this was a mess hall game, and I think for an insight into all this, you can hardly do better than read Plain Tales from the Hills by Rudyard Kipling, talking about those hill stations such as Simla. And for the best insight into life there, you might check the BBC series Plain Tales from the Raj, which is a deliberately similar title, and you can find it. It's been archived online. I couldn't find a place where the BBC was making it available, but other people have made this BBC series available. So Plain Tales from the Hills, Plain Tales from the Raj, gives an insight into life there, where games like snooker were becoming more and more popular. I'll carry on with the gentleman's research, because it is interesting, I think. He says, "It's generally accepted the term snooker as applied to the game came from a name given to first-year cadets at the Royal Academy at Woolwich. This would appear to have been in use in the early 1870s. Chamberlain, having first been made aware of it in 1875, but where did it originate? Dictionaries tell us that the phrase cock a snook first appeared in print as early as 1791, and has been suggested that the novice recruits earned their name by their habit of cheekily cocking a snook at their non-commissioned officers, their NCOs. There's also, according to him, an intriguing and colourful alternative. In the 1850s, there was a comedy duo called Hooker and Snooker, who were performing in the London theatres during the earliest days of music hall variety acts. So it could be that Mr. Snooker's character was sarcastically applied by the older candidates to the younger juniors at Woolwich, and the name kind of stuck. So it could be that this is the legacy of an actor otherwise completely forgotten. There's little available history on who was Mr. Snooker, but it could be that this was a term applied to hapless young cadets. Anyway, all part of the history of snooker, which largely comes from Brits. In India, of course, you can find some interesting reference to that time in the Agatha Christie novel Murder on the Orient Express. In the novel and in the classic adaptations, there's a fairly recent one with Kenneth Branagh in which they completely remove all those characters. There's a character played by Sean Connery in the 70s who gets completely written out of the modern version. But I do think that's worth either reading or seeing. And of course I first read that in the hotel what was written, made an impression on me. But those bits where it refers to British India, I thought, I don't know, maybe they would give some insight into the history of snooker there. Okay, the next most popular topic was Scotland. Thank you to Daniel Gaster and Budget Bond for suggesting that S is for Scotland. Surely the most prominent Scotsman in America is groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons, who, commenting on Bart and Lisa Simpson, says, "Oh, brothers and sisters are natural enemies, like Englishmen and Scots, or Welshmen and Scots, or Japanese and Scots, or Scots and other Scots. Damn Scots, they ruined Scotland." He's talking to Principal Skinner, who replies, "You Scots sure are a contentious people." And groundskeeper Willie replied, "You just made an enemy for life." Fine representation of Scotland there in The Simpsons. So, S is for Scotland. I spent a fair while reading up on Scotland, and like many, I tend to think of Scotland as kind of England was Roman Britain, and Scotland was the bits they couldn't conquer. So there's Hadrian's Wall that separates it, and the north, is wild and unconquerable. That's the Scots, and then the south of Scotland, Hadrian's Wall. It's all the civilised bits. And I believe George R.R. Martin, when writing Game of Thrones, A Song of Fire and Ice, he said that the wall there is inspired by Hadrian's Wall. However, I started to look into the National Museums of Scotland website. I discovered a much more complex and interesting history, which actually shows Roman influence as far north as the Shetland Islands. Of course, there's Hadrian's Wall, the big stone one. There's the Antonine Wall, much further north. But apparently there are also Roman sea voyages that went all around Scotland, which I've done myself. And I have to say, I'd been living in the Mediterranean for about 7 years. Then I did this, and it was a bit of a shock in terms of climate. So all power to the Romans for their ability to do this. And they seem to have settlements and Roman-inspired settlements, actually all throughout the lowlands. According to their website, even when Rome's armies were back on Hadrian's Wall, they kept a careful eye to the north. After all, a good general always knows what his neighbours are doing. With a combination of scouts, punitive raids and diplomatic activities, the Roman world stayed involved in Caledonia until the Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century. These relations with Rome were a key part of the early history of Scotland. Well, what better source than the National Museums of Scotland? So yeah, their early history is very, very much as part of Roman history as English history is. which interested me. And there are people who say that, yes, Hadrian's Wall was a military fortification. It was also, a trading post. It was also, used for taxation, bringing goods north and south. It was a method of control one way or the other. Of course, I know that for many, many around the world, the image they have of Scotland is from the movie Braveheart. I must admit, I missed it when it came out in the cinemas, and I haven't caught up with it since. I have entertained myself many, many times by Googling Braveheart, historical inaccuracies, and it tops the list of pretty well every list of historically inaccurate films I've ever seen, which entertains me enormously. Maybe at some point I'll watch the film itself and it will entertain me even more. I think the quote from the historian Peter Tranquaire, I don't know how to say his name, I've seen it written many times, but his popular quote from the book Freedom's Sword is that Wallace is a farcical representation as a wild and hairy Highlander, painted with woad 1,000 years too late, running amok in a tartan kilt 500 years too early. So yeah, they didn't wear kilts back then. The kilts that they wear apparently are the wrong style. He's claimed that it's kind of like a film about George Washington in which he wears a conservative 21st century business suit inside out. Except that there's only about 200 years between him and us, and there's 500 years for William Wallace of the film and when he should be wearing a kilt. And of course the wearing of woad is about the ancient Britons. Braveheart is also the wrong name. So the character in the movie is William Wallace, but Braveheart is the term for Robert the Bruce. So it is extraordinary that the man in the film has the wrong name. He has face paint he shouldn't be wearing, and he's wearing the wrong outfit. Apparently there's a quote in the movie from the ending. Sorry to spoil the film for anyone. In the year of our Lord 1314, patriots of Scotland, starving and outnumbered, charged the fields of Bannockburn. They fought like warrior poets, they fought like Scotsmen and won their freedom. Well, no, because after the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce continued his fight against the English for a further 14 years. So yes, a mere 14 years later. It also is extraordinary in its portrayal of Edward I. So I understand that in the film he wants to sleep with a random woman. Is it William Wallace's wife? Again, I haven't seen the film, but it does seem extraordinary. Of course, many medieval kings did have many, many mistresses, but the thing is, they have a film in which they have the one king we know didn't. He was an absolutely devoted husband. We know it's extraordinary, we know it's unusual, but he was, in fact, if you've heard of the tube stop Charing Cross in London, it's named after one of the monuments that Edward I built to his wife after she passed away. And he is an extraordinary man, known to generations as Longshanks. He's the conqueror of Scotland, nemesis of Braveheart, Sir William Wallace. His reign is one of the most dramatic of the Middle Ages. There's a book which I read many years ago by Mark Morris called A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Forging of Britain, and it is an astonishingly action-packed life. Edward defeated and killed the famous Simon de Montfort in battle. I believe as a teenager he travelled to the Holy Land on crusade. He definitely did conquer Wales, and of course built extraordinary castles, Conway, Harlech and Carnarvon, and again the Eleanor crosses that he created after the death of his wife are the grandest funeral monuments ever fashioned for an English monarch. So I think he's an extraordinary character, but as is Robert the Bruce. I mean, we're all taught the story of Robert the Bruce after being defeated by the English, going into the cave and watching a spider kind of climb up a wall and fall down, climb up a wall and fall down. Eventually it tries again, and eventually it can create its web, so if at first you don't succeed, try again. So, Braveheart, I'm sure at some point I'll see it, but if only to find out, what is this fuss and why did it do so well when it seems bonkers. I talked to a friend of mine who loves the film, and he said, yeah, it's complete nonsense, but you enjoy Lord of the Rings, you enjoy Star Wars. I'm sure the Millennium Falcon doesn't go 0.5 beyond light speed. What a ship made in Corellia of that kind. Anyway, Scotland. If I were to give you a recommended rabbit hole on Scotland, it actually would not be William Wallace, and it would probably not be Robert the Bruce, although he is interesting. My recommended rabbit hole is Scots in the British Empire. I think that is a particularly interesting thing, and it has been pointed out by more than a few that the decline of the British Empire kind of precedes the rise in Scottish nationalism. Once there was no more empire to bash about in, they started to become more interested in independence, less interested in the UK. Give us an empire to build. The Scots were magnificent at that. So yeah, Scots and the British Empire, my recommended rabbit hole. I must touch on tartan because it's so associated with Scotland, even though people all over the world, in early development of cloth, you just naturally come up with Scotland. But in Scotland, it seems to have this real cultural significance. And here I was looking at the Scottish Tartan Museum. Again, go to Scotland for some sources on Scotland. I've often heard it said that really the idea of clan tartans doesn't exist in history until the 19th century. And they largely agree with this, saying that, well, yeah, traditionally, a family might make it in a particular way, but that's the same everywhere in the world. But, of course, the Victorians were very interested in kind of codifying things, classifying things, applying scientific genealogies and methodologies to things. So in 1815, the Highland Society of London wrote to clan chiefs asking them to submit samples of their clan tartans. The response was that many chiefs had no idea what their clan tartan was, so they wrote either to their tartan suppliers or asked older men if they recalled anything in particular being worn. And by 1822, when King George IV visited Edinburgh, a kind of a tartan festival partly organised by Sir Walter Scott, all the clan chiefs were asked to come out and greet the king in their, quote, proper clan tartan. So again, many didn't have a clan tartan. There were loads of new tartans created or renamed, and from this point on it was kind of became fashionable, the idea that every clan must have its tartan. They don't have quite such a long formalised history, although again a particular village might have one it prefers, but even the Scottish Tartan Museums admits that what makes a tartan, quote, official or, quote, authentic is not age or antiquity, but whether it has the approval of a governing body of what the tartan represents. So, if a clan chief or a state's legislature or the CEO of a company says it's the official tartan, then it is the official tartan, whether it's 2 years old or 200 years old. Brilliantly, I suppose that means that if I came up with a British culture Albin Never Dies tartan, apparently if I say it is my tartan, then apparently it is. If I have somebody working for me one day, and I force them to wear the tartan, then there you go. It is my podcast tartan, even if I've just made it up. Anyway, I think that's really interesting. The idea of it being a formalised thing is a very much a modern idea from the 19th century. Whereas, of course, traditionally, yeah, people in the village might wear broadly of that style, of course. Anyway, Scotland is a gorgeous country. It has a natural beauty that's hard to match. As I say, I've taken a ship all around the Isles of Scotland. I have experienced, I think, dreich weather. I've heard some people say dreich. I've been told dreich, but that's where you get all types of weather at once. And I've had that on the top of a ship. It's something to do with the way the Western Isles break up different weather patterns, and so you get kind of sunshine, sleet, rain, hail, everything all at once, and wind from every direction. It is quite surreal, and I did feel that I was on a movie set with people kind of randomly chucking different weathers at me at the same time. But anyway, it is a very, very beautiful country. But that is all I have to say about that. So I must move on with some of the other suggestions. As I say, I'll be doing this for the whole month of January, but I think for this episode I do want to include, thanks to Mr. Purdy for suggesting this, S is for SAS.
Oh, you are? I like this poker thing. And that makes perfect sense. Since MI6 looks for maladjusted young men, I give little thought to sacrificing others in order to protect Queen and country. Former SAS types with easy smiles and expensive watches. Rolex?
Amiga.
Beautiful.
British Special Forces, the Special Air Service. I very rarely touch on military history. There is a lot of people who have immense amounts of detailed, specialised knowledge, and they go deep into military affairs. So I've very rarely been tempted to go into this, but okay. SAS, I might add in here the SBS. And they're often kind of conflated and confused, especially perhaps one of the better known SAS veterans or SBS veterans was Jeremy John Durham Ashdown, better known as Paddy Ashdown. He died as Lord Ashdown, born February 1941, died December 2018. I thought I'd go into his obituary in The Guardian. The Guardian is not always the friendliest to SAS types, so I thought I'd go along with theirs because it might be one of the more critical ones. As I say, he's one of the more prominent people. They had to amend it because they originally referred to him not as SAS but as SBS, but he'd actually fought with the Special Boat Service before it had its current name. So, let's first of all get into who he is. Paddy Ashdown was perhaps the most unlikely leader of the liberal strand of British politics. Former captain in the Royal Marines, ex-diplomat and rumoured a spy, he became the first leader of the Liberal Democrats in 1988 and led them over the next 11 years to their best electoral results at that time for 3/4 of a century. Although he never quite achieved the parliamentary breakthrough he hoped for, still less a realignment of the parties of the left in coalition with Labour, the Lib Dems became a significant and influential third force in British politics. So whilst the US, of course, is a two-party system, with Paddy Ashdown we ended up with a three-party system pretty well. Two major and one minor, but significant. I like this kind of segment by The Guardian. Square-jawed, eyes narrowed as if constantly scanning the horizon, resolutely refusing to confirm or deny that he knew how to kill a man with his bare hands from his days fighting communist insurgents in the jungles of Borneo with the Marine Special Boat Section. Ashdown looked like a leader of a more militant party than he actually led. If he was helped in the early 1990s by voters' growing disillusionment with the Tories' initial reluctance in Southern Shire constituencies to trust Labour, he also had to overcome a ramshackle and near-bankrupt National Party machine and often non-existent local organisations. It continues. Ashdown was the oldest of 7 children, born in New Delhi, the son of John Ashdown, an Ulster Protestant who was also an Indian Army captain, and his Ulster Catholic wife, Lois, who had been an army nurse. The family did not return to Northern Ireland until after the end of the war, when his father invested his savings in a pig farm and then a market garden, both of which failed. Ashdown was christened Jeremy John Durham, but gained his nickname Paddy from his Irish accent when his father managed to obtain a place for him at Bedford School, where he himself had been educated. The accent was soon lost, although the nickname never was, and Ashdown was offered a military scholarship which paid the school fees. He excelled at sport, but not academic study. He failed his French O-level, though later became proficient in several languages, including Mandarin, Hindi, Malay, Serbo-Croat, German, and indeed French. I would suggest languages became important to him when they became useful. Just my thought. The Guardian continues. He joined the Royal Marines straight up from school at about the time his parents decided to make a new life in Australia. Ashdown served for 12 years in the Marines and saw action as a commando in Kuwait, Borneo, Hong Kong and Northern Ireland, where, in the early days of the Troubles, he was once required to arrest the Catholic civil rights activist and future fellow MP, John Hume, on the streets of Belfast. In interviews many years later, Ashdown insisted that had he been an Ulster Catholic, he would probably have joined the IRA or at least campaigned for civil rights himself. His fluency in Chinese led to a posting with the diplomatic service, formerly as First Secretary to the UN's mission to the United Nations in Geneva, where he was, allegedly, Ashdown was coy on the matter, required to listen in on the conversations of the Chinese delegation and cultivate contacts. But he threw up his promising diplomatic career for family life in Norton-sub-Hampden, a Somerset village near Yeovil, with his wife Jane, whom he had met at a military ball when he was 20 and married in 1962. And their 2 small children, and he joined the local Liberal Association. He wrote in his memoirs, the decision was naive to the point of irresponsibility. Quote, "It just also happens to be the best decision I made in my life." Okay, so I just thought that would be of particular interest to people who follow my Instagram, Fleming Never Dies, because they're interested in Bond stuff, which tends to touch on, SBS or diplomatic service or things like that. So I thought that might be interesting. Of course, his political career and political scandals, highs and lows, are something you can happily follow off your own Google travels. And I just thought I'd have a quick look at the James Bond kind of military service. Of course, each cinematic iteration of Bond has had a slightly different military service. The one for Daniel Craig suggests that he's been with the Special Forces Unit 030, which is supposedly some part of the SBS, and that he's seen covert service in Iraq, Somalia, Iran, Libya, and active service in Bosnia. Upon completion of his duties in Bosnia, Bond was credited with saving the lives of nearly 100 men from a Serbian militia in one village, and Bond was recruited by the R&R Defence Intelligence Group and awarded the rank of Commander. So there is the link between the popular character James Bond and the SBS. I have more S's to cover, but I shall keep this at the 30-minute mark. I shall cover them later in the month. We have more S's coming up. S is for The Saint, for example. Of course, a popular TV show with Roger Moore, and books by Leslie Charteris. I shall be covering those with a very, very special guest very, very soon. Those were my initial S's. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you'd like to suggest some more S's, as I say, I'll be doing this all month. You can message me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies. You can email me at albionneverdies@gmail.com, and I'll be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening. More coming up this January.